Our next speaker is John Whelan. He's the chair of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. He's also a leader and program manager for Santander's Corporate Investment Bank's digital asset program.
Connor, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I guess I'm one of the folks who's been around the enterprise blockchain space for quite a while, but which has become now, I think in many of the financial institutions, digital assets programs. Just a bit about my background. I'm currently based in Madrid in Spain. I'm actually calling from this secure location, which is the Santander's global headquarters just outside Madrid. Currently, I'm attached to the Corporate and Investment Bank here, and I run the digital assets program, which for us these days actually means three things, right? Digital securities, these would be blockchain-based bonds, equities, derivatives, collateral, digital cash, which could be stablecoins, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, wholesale use cases, retail use cases. And then I would say increasingly, though, kind of baby steps related to crypto, Bitcoin, Ether, DeFi, decentralized finance, NFTs, non-fungible tokens, formerly known as intellectual property rights, etc. So kind of a broad, let's say, space of operation that we work in. I've been with the Corporate and Investment Bank for just about 3 years now. And before that, I actually was the original director of Santander's blockchain lab, going back to 2016, where we did some of the really early research work in enterprise grade use cases for DLT and blockchain. We were also one of the founding members of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance once we realized early on that Ethereum and what it could do in its various forms. And there are different forms of Ethereum, whether they're, the mainnet, of course, very interesting. ETH2 is coming. We're seeing side chains like Matic. We're seeing ETH compatible, other public mainnets like Avalanche and Near Protocol and others. And then there's a whole range of, let's say, private permission deployments of Ethereum and similar. Now, having said that, Santander also is very familiar and uses the other blockchain technologies that are out there for enterprise purposes, things like Hyperledger Fabric, things like R3's Corda, and perhaps even the stack from digital assets, etc. So it's quite a wide-ranging topic. And before joining the bank, I'm proud to say I was a failed cryptocurrency startup founder in Chicago, 2 rounds of capital in Silicon Valley. And sometimes when things don't go well, you're supposed to spend the money that the venture people give you and then find something else to do, which is what I did. And I came to a bank, which was kind of exciting at the time. Now, kind of what led me here on this journey a little bit also was a former time in my life. I was a floor trader at the Chicago Board Options Exchange in the trading pits long time ago, and was always interested in volatile assets, and of course stumbled across Bitcoin in 2012. Didn't stumble across it properly, just maybe from a more intellectual standpoint. And started to ask questions about, what is this thing? How does it work? And of course, obviously, you're all here on this call. You understand going down the rabbit hole of figuring out what a DLT is and the programmable nature of smart contracts, and kind of really see what the promise and potential of all of this might be. So I thought what I would do today is maybe tell a bit of a story, which is kind of part of my job. As my day job in charge of digital assets at Santander here in Madrid. And even though I'm the chairman of the board of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, I'm going to focus more on the day job and tell the story of digital securities and the kinds of things. And I'll be as open as I can. Obviously, there's a caveat that, a lot of things we work on in the financial industry are indeed, private, and we're not supposed to talk about them. And that's okay. Everybody understands how that works. But I thought I would tell maybe a little bit of a story about the journey that the world really has been on with regards to digital securities, blockchain-based securities. Digital securities, a discussion. Now, we're all, of course, familiar with the idea of tokenization now. Seems kind of obvious, but there was a time when I guess we weren't. I was around in the early days, just after Ethereum had launched. There was no ERC20 standard. There were no ERC 721s, 223s, 1400s, all of these things we know and love these days, right? And the first steps were really about, issuing utility tokens. We experienced, of course, in 2017, 2018, the ICO phenomenon. And it was really at that time, I think, that a little bit more mainstream finance started to get interested in the idea of digital securities. Now, I should explain what a security is, just for those of you who don't spend a lot of time in the financial industry. Simply a financial product. Could be an equity where you own stock in a company. It could be a bond, which is a kind of a loan, where a borrower is probably a company. Sometimes they're called issuers, the issuer of the note instrument that describes the loan, and there are investors who contribute their money into these things. There are other types of securities and financial instruments like derivatives and collateral of different flavors and types. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. What we're describing here, from my point of view, really going back to April 2017, is kind of the set of steps that we've seen in the evolution of blockchain-based securities. And what's really interesting is nearly every one of these has been issued on some flavor of Ethereum, a couple on private permission networks, and a couple on public mainnet. And there's obviously an interesting data point there. First of all, as you're well aware, there are a ton of developers out there who understand how to build smart contracts on Solidity and how to build, the kinds of applications that are needed. It really all started, the first, what I would call mainstream security that was issued, started in April 2017 from a company called Blockchain Capital, which is a venture capital firm that's based in San Francisco. And usually a venture capital firm has what they call limited partners who contribute funds into the venture capital firm, and those funds get invested. Now, most times, the funds that limited partners contribute are not particularly liquid. The limited partner has to wait 7 or 8 years until they get their money back. Hopefully it's more money than they put in, but that's the idea behind VC. Now, in this case, the company Blockchain Capital, they took a tranche of the limited partner investment funds and they tokenized them, issued them as ERC20s on the public Ethereum network. And this particular investment was available, I think, usual story, it's what's called Reg S, available to non-US accredited investors that could purchase this digital token. The idea being that the ownership interest in that limited partnership on the venture capital fund itself could indeed be liquid and tradable in some of the crypto exchanges that are out there. And by and large, it was moderately successful. It proved that you could, in fact, issue a real security, for real, on a public permissionless network. Now, take a step forward about a year in 2018, August, the World Bank, good friends of mine, good colleagues of mine in mainstream financial industry, they issued a programmable digital bond, again tokenized, on a private permissioned version of Ethereum. I think Microsoft actually was the technology company that provided some of the tech support. And in that regard, it was another bank, broker-dealer in Australia called Commonwealth Bank of Australia, otherwise known as CBA, that facilitated the transaction and helped place the digital bond with investors. And what they wanted to do in this case was really, prove that various parts of the life cycle of the security could in fact be operated or processed on an Ethereum variant network. And it turned out the bond was issued. There are various coupon payments, which are interest payments that have to be made quarterly, etc., and quite successful in its own regard. About a year later, our good colleagues, good friends of mine at Société Générale, Jean-Marc Stenger and David Duracho, they began their journey of digital bond issuance, where they issued inside the Société Générale group among itself a public Ethereum denominated bond. that was settled or cleared and settled along traditional payment rails using traditional Swift messages, etc. And okay, so you've got a digital bond and you've got normal payment rails of Swift, which is a service that mainstream financial institutions use many times a day for processing messages and ultimately payments. In September 2019, this was the first digital bond issuance that came from Banco Santander. My small team and I led the project. It took us about 14 months to organize everything. But in this case, we created a digital representation of the security, the bond, and we also created our own ERC20 stablecoin in order to use both digital security and digital cash, so we could perform what is called, and this is a technical term in the financial industry, it's called delivery versus payment, this simultaneous, irrevocable exchange of title of cash and security. So you got digital bond, digital cash, you can do this simultaneous DVP, delivery versus payment. In the blockchain world, we would call that an atomic swap. But if I want to scare my colleagues, I say the word atomic and it kind of gets them a little bit excited. But the interesting thing about Santander's bond in 2019, we used 4 separate legal entities of the group to do this. So even though it was inside the bank as a group, we had different legal entities. The issuer of the bond, a $20 million instrument, a real bond, real money, real dollars, real rights and obligations to cash flows, real coupon payments, etc., was issued by our corporate parent. Another bank in the group acted as an investor. I work for the investment bank, so we're kind of the broker dealer in the middle. And then underneath, we used our own custodian, Santander Securities Services at the time, to act as the custodian of the cryptographic keys, right? This is a concept we all know, digital custody of long random numbers known as cryptographic keys. And we had a Spanish issuer, bank is based in Spain. We had a Spanish investor, and we did all of this under English governing, the law of England and Wales. So I would say UK governing law. And there were good reasons for that. UK law, when it comes to securities issuance in kind of a private placement format where it's not publicly made available for trade, between an issuer of a security and investors in the security, it basically says you need a register of ownership. Register could be a piece of paper, could be an Excel spreadsheet, could be a blockchain, public or private, or it could be a central securities depository, your choice. So obviously we had a bit of legal work to do to justify and verify that that was in fact valid. But in this case, we tokenized the security leg on the public Ethereum blockchain, we tokenized the cash leg on the public Ethereum blockchain, and then did delivery versus payment, and the whole thing cleared and settled again on public Ethereum. Moving on to January 2020, our friends at Society, not wanting to sit on their laurels, and because the world is an inherently competitive place, our good colleagues at Societe Generale proceeded with another bond issuance. This one, I'm not certain, but I think it was on the Tezos network, which, as you're familiar, is another smart contracts platform that's been around for a few years. It's quite usable for these things. It's got its own smart contracts language. It's been stable since inception. It appears to be experiencing increasing usage. Probably somewhat of a competitor to Ethereum mainnet, but at the same time is an alternative option. And our friends at SocGen, in this case, they did another inside their group digital bond issuance, where the clearing leg, the settlement leg from the investor was actually through an experimental CBDC, central bank digital currency, that is part of a program being operated by Banque de France. And Banque de France is the central bank of France, and as such, it is part of the Eurozone system. Now, that takes us forward to 4 weeks ago. Again, we worked on this one for probably about a year, maybe a little bit over, where 3 global investment banks, I'm sure you recognize the names now, Goldman Sachs, of course, Societe Generale, and Banco Santander. Together, we acted as, the technical term in the financial industry is called joint lead managers. It really means we act as kind of co-dealers on a transaction. The European Investment Bank, which is the arm of the European Union that borrows a bunch of money for building all the roads and railroads and airports and all these, European Union level things that we see if you travel around Europe at all, was the actual issuer of the security, the bond itself. The investors that participated in the transaction, we treated this as a normal transaction, just like we would any other bond instrument. We went out and we did what's called a road show, where we spent time with investors explaining the European Investment Bank is issuing a new debt security, and here's the reasons why, Mr. or Mrs. Investor, you should invest in it. We also we had access to the experimental program that is being offered by the Banque de France currently. So we settled part of the transaction, and I'll explain this in a second. We settled part of the transaction using the experimental CBDC, central bank digital currency, that was made available to us by Banque de France. And once again, we did the whole thing: security leg, cash leg, delivery versus payment on the public Ethereum blockchain. People ask me a lot of times, usually my colleagues in the financial industry, saying, well, why would you use the public Ethereum blockchain for doing something like this? Surely you'd use a private permission chain. And the answer is yes, you might use a private permission chain if you had ready access to one that was up and running, that was designed and being operated specifically for securities issuances. But the truth is, there aren't really any today. There's some that are in experimental form. And even though the public mainnet from ETH1 is probably not performant enough, it's probably not doesn't have sufficient privacy, and it probably is not permissionable enough, although it is in the right context. It's quite usable, right, for doing one-off, something that's experimental, something that even though it's a real-world transaction, real money in the market, can actually prove again that you can use a public chain, a public utility that's available for anybody in the world to record the issuance of a security. Now, in this case, the security was an ERC20, a modified ERC20. The cash leg was a modified ERC20. We did this kind of on-chain delivery versus payment, as I explained. And we did all of this for this transaction under French governing law. And the reason why we chose French law, well, in part, I think that, Société Générale being a French bank, and they'd done a couple of bond issuances and actually have a really strong technical team and digital assets team. It just seemed like a natural thing to do. And also as well with the European Investment Bank itself, being based in Luxembourg, close proximity to France, good reason to do it. And the availability of the experimental central bank digital currency leg made it quite interesting. Now, typically in a securities issuance, it's very often a two-step process. And let me explain what that means. So usually there's an issuer of the security, there's the underwriters, the dealers, and then there are the ultimate investors. Now, many times in a securities transaction, the dealers will commit to underwrite the transaction. What that means is that the dealers will buy the security first from the issuer, then they mark it up a few points and they resell the security onto the investors. And that's kind of the standard, I would say, distribution model of most securities in the marketplace. So in this particular case, what the three dealers did is we underwrote the transaction, and I'll explain the term sheet of the transaction here in just a second. It's quite interesting by itself. But we underwrote the transaction. In other words, we purchased the security, the bond, from the issuer, and then we transmitted this underwriting step where the dealers purchased the bond from the issuer. We actually settled that underwriting step with the central bank digital currency from Banque de France. And then there's an allocation that is done subsequently from the dealers to the investors. And that piece we settle using traditional cash, using fairly standard settlement processes, wiring bank funds from the investor account to one of the dealer accounts, etc. That's the history of securities issuance on public blockchains or private permission blockchains to date. There are a lot more interesting things to come. The two steps I think that are remaining that are most interesting to me, number one, are listing the instruments and then making them available for trading on regulated secondary markets, and we'll get there over time. We just, baby steps. We have to bite these things off step by step. On the right hand side there, that little screenshot or photograph that I have is actually from a Bloomberg terminal. Some of you will recognize it, of course. Bloomberg is a financial industry news source or data source where you can type in the ISIN, the International Securities Identification Number of a security, and you can pull up all its details. And you can do that with the Bloomberg today. And I think the ISIN of the instrument is probably on there somewhere. All right, next one. Okay. And to be fair, a lot of what we work on in the financial industry may not be perceived to be the most exciting, most cutting edge stuff out there. I mean, if we look at what's going on in the world of DeFi, for example, and NFTs, but the truth is we operate in such a regulated environment. Every single step that we take receives an enormous amount of scrutiny from regulators and from our own internal new products approval process, let's say. I'll give you an example, like, at Santander, our new products approval committee probably has, 12 or 15 subcommittees of all different topics: tax, audit, internal audit, cybersecurity, blah, 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 risk, etc. So there's a long and disciplined process. Anyway. I
was going to say, John, a couple of questions have now come in on the chat. So the first one was from Marius, which is saying, are those experiments eventually shaping up to become a Santander IB service offering in the future?
So I truly believe that in the future, all securities and financial instruments will probably be blockchain-based, programmable digital instruments where the full life cycle of the security is managed in a shared ledger environment. Now, the program that we've been running for the last 3 years, by necessity, is experimental. If we're successful, and it's a big if, but if we're successful and the blockchains become performant enough, if that happens, I think that it would be reasonable to anticipate that these types of digital issuance become kind of normal business as usual in some fashion. Now, whether or not it's Santander doing it or some other investment bank, that's always hard to predict because of the competitive nature of the market. But I can see clearly a convergence between token sales and the process that guides those and something like a traditional security. Traditional securities are more regulated, and there's a lot of discussion with the regulators about what needs to change, let's say, in the regulations to allow it to happen. But it's by no means is it beyond the realms of possibility. I think you can see with the timeline and the increasing kind of level of prominence of the different participants, there is a path that we're on, but it's difficult to predict how and when it becomes a genuine commercial proposition. And that's just being honest. I'd love to see it get there. We're not just, twiddling our thumbs here, doing experiments for fun. It would be great to see it become a real thing, but it's not clear when or how that will happen.
There's another question, which is, are you looking at prime brokerage, stock borrowing, and other areas of securitization on the chain?
Baby steps. I think that all of the traditional functions in a securities transaction process can be automated and delivered on chain in some fashion, or off chain, layer 2s or side chains, or you can use layer 1s and run your order matching systems and your exchanges off chain. All of that actually naturally has to happen if the infrastructure of the financial industry is to be upgraded over time and just become DLT native. We talk about it as being digital securities and blockchain-based bonds. The truth is they're just bonds. Look at this instrument here. AAA rating, okay, check that box. Pricing date, settlement date, maturity, 2-year maturity, amount 100 million euro. It's kind of crazy to think that there's a AAA rated 100 million euro instrument sitting on public Ethereum right now. If someone had said that 3 years ago, people would have said that's crazy, it'll never happen. However, progress, things move forward. But I'll give you an example. So, for instance, if a European issuer wanted to issue in dollars, chances are then they would also need, oops, let me go back. Chances are then they would also need to add another a financial instrument on top called a swap, to swap the dollar exposure back to euro exposure. So there is a need in thinking about, let's say, digital bond issuances. At some point, we're going to need a swap market. Now, beyond that, we would need to know that the bonds themselves are eligible under the various central bank programs to be used as collateral for various borrowing purposes. That's called HQLA, high quality liquid assets. Currently, digital instruments like this, Ethereum-based bonds, Ethereum-based anything, are not eligible for HQLA. We will need to see things like repo markets. A repo is a particular type of financial instrument called a repurchase agreement. It's very simple loan and buy back over a 5 or 7 day period. And then naturally you'd need to see other components as well, like collateral management, shorting ability, all the pieces in the whole chain. We're not going to solve it all in one go. So we have to take baby steps. And there are different parts of the financial industry that are kind of examining the different pieces that are relevant for them. For example, Santander is not a meaningful custody bank, but some of the large custodians, I think there's been some news recently, for example, are good friends. Also, a board member and founding member of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, BNY Mellon, Bank of New York Mellon, are very interested in figuring out digital custody, not just for digital securities, but I guess different forms of crypto assets as well. And they've been quite vocal in the market. I think they've got a partnership now with Fireblocks that have a very interesting, really robust custody engine solution. So depending on the profile of the financial institution, tackling the different bits of the value chain. Bit of a long-winded answer. I apologize for that.
So all good. There's another question, and this is from Lee, and he's rightly saying you're being too modest. It is really exciting, and he's surprised it's not got more mainstream coverage already. The fact it's been done with regulatory approvals is a big deal. He wants to know, could the same or a similar digital bond be issued in New York under the DFS plus Fed regulations today? If not, is the barrier at a state or federal level or both? Would you happen to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we need much in the way of mainstream press or anything like that. Trust me, in our little industry, the people who need to know, they know. And that's enough for me, right? I think that our peers in the financial industry, the regulators who are paying attention, a lot of colleagues in let's say the crypto world, they're interested to see what we're doing in the financial industry as well. And we try to play in our we're not playing Champions League, and maybe we're not even playing first division, but we're somewhere on the ladder, right? Maybe it's second division. Now with regards to issuance in the United States, now I'm going to caveat this and just mention, of course, as we have to, I'm not a lawyer, but here's what I think is possible. For a publicly listed security in the United States, my understanding is that there's an SEC requirement that the instrument needs to be listed with the DTC. That's the Depository Trust Corporation, which is like a central securities depository. And they're tasked with keeping the record of all the securities that are issued. Okay. Now, that means if you were to tokenize the asset, you'd have to issue the instrument under normal circumstances first, and then you'd create kind of a mirror, which would be a digital token that represents the real world asset. From my point of view, that's possible, that's interesting, but it's not as interesting as actually using the blockchain as the native register of record, where the token on the blockchain, that's legal ownership, right? That's not a copy, it's not a mirror, but it's legal ownership. Now, I saw recently our friends at Securities. You may know Carlos Domingo and some colleagues there from Securities. Santander is an investor in Securities going back a couple of years. My understanding is they did an issuance recently for a private security. Now, with a private security, I believe that you can use the register of ownership. You can use a blockchain, public or private. I think they used a public one. And then you can make it for trading, eligible for trading in a regulated venue or trading facility. In the United States, it's called an ATS, Alternative Trading System, and that's a regulated trading venue. In the European Union, our EU equivalent is an MTF, which is a multilateral trading facility, but more or less the similar kind of thing. So as usual, the answer is it depends. It depends if you want to do a publicly listed instrument, in which case you have to issue first traditional and then tokenize the traditional version, or if you want to do a private issuance with a cap, I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe it's about $75 million is where the cap is in terms of what you're allowed to do under a private issuance format. But there's a couple of, you can Google it, and securitized bond issuance, go back a couple of months, you'll find out what they did recently, and basically that's what's allowable currently. Let me think about what might be interesting. I have another slide here, but I don't have enough time to go through it, which is the workflow of all the steps involved, and it's a little bit intricate. I'm going to put it up on the screen, and I'll just talk generally about it. It's also not very detailed, and it's more kind of a schema. Actually, it was a schematic that our technical team put together for ourselves to help understand what we were doing, right? We didn't really use it outside too much, but it kind of gives a flavor for how it works. What are we looking at here? Oof, lots of lines and everything. Okay. Basically, you're all familiar with swim lane diagrams. If any of you have spent any time in engineering or software development, what we try to represent here is the steps in the workflow that are necessary from issuance all the way down through ultimate settlement with the investors. We represent each step. If you look across the top, there are different participants listed. I'm going to work from left to right. I won't explain all the roles. It's quite complex. I don't have enough time, but we've got the issuer there, the borrower, broker dealer, that was us. Cash correspondent is actually another bank that behaves in an agency role on behalf of the issuer, that handles the cash and the digital tokens that are received on behalf of the issuer. Banque de France in the middle, BDF, was the central bank issuing CBDC, central bank digital currency tokens. There's a registrar function. If you're issuing under French law allows you to use the DLT, the blockchain, public or private, as the record of ownership, but it does specify that a registrar is responsible for maintaining the record of ownership. And that's kind of a regulated function. The registrar is an agent of the issuer. That's how it works. In this case, the registrar was a subsidiary of Societe Generale. Then there's a settlement agent. When you're doing kind of a synthetic delivery versus payment like we did here, we use the settlement agent basically to verify that the funds have in fact been received by the person who's supposed to receive the money. So money moves first, and then the bonds move. And then last on the list here is the investor. There's a set of 16 steps. Each of the arrows, blue arrows represent kind of basic workflow steps. Green arrows represent real cash. That is real money. When the real money needs to move, it's represented in green. Red arrows represent digital cash tokens, ERC20s that are actually CBDCs. And then black arrows represent the movement of the bonds, or the triggering of the movement of the bonds. Whether that's, if you look at step 9, for example, that's where the registrar has verified via a settlement agent, and this is step 8, the previous step, that the funds have been received by the cash correspondent acting on behalf of the issuer, and that triggers the exchange of title of cash and securities, where the securities end up in step 9 in the hands of the broker dealer. And then beyond step 9, there's the redemption step, where the central bank digital currency needs to be redeemed for real cash from the Banque de France, and that happens in a couple of steps. It's actually kind of similar to how you might redeem a stablecoin. Even though a CBDC has some of the characteristics of a stablecoin, it has these wonderful credit characteristics of a central bank: zero credit risk, zero counterparty risk, settlement finality, all of these good things we like to see in the securities world. Then once we get into steps 13 to 16, that's the allocation step of how the bonds get transferred from the broker dealers, ourselves, the joint lead managers, to the investor. The investor sends some cash. There's a couple of confirmations in step 14, 15, and then the bonds, the registrar triggers the update of ownership of the record on the DLT in the token contract, and ultimately the bonds end up in the hands of the investors. And it was interesting, sending settlement instructions. I wrote them by hand for investors. You want digital bonds, send the broker dealer some money to this bank account. We'll confirm we receive it. And then we will provide a link to Etherscan to show you where the record of ownership of your bonds, and it's the legal record of ownership. Or if you're capable of running a node, you could pull it directly via the API, etc. So a little bit experimental in nature, but real money, completely legally valid and fully enforceable under French law. And it took us about 14 months end to end to work with all the banks, lots of law firms involved, really big project, heavy lift. I'll stop there. I'll answer a final question if there is one, and then pass it back to Connor.
Okay, we've got a question. The securities are becoming far more complex with the rise of SPACs and their effect on the junk bond market, and recent issuance of wrap securities by Binance introduces one possible way for centralized markets to transition. Do you have a prediction on how you see this transition continuing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so they're kind of what I call vanilla securities. This was a vanilla security, just a bond. Certain equities are vanilla securities. I think you've observed already that the people in the financial industry are extraordinarily creative. Not as creative as blockchain engineers, but they're pretty creative in terms of what they're creating as far as new forms of financial instruments. I think that if you add ability that you can get in, let's say, a blockchain, let's say an ERC20, it's just, whatever, 35 lines of code. You can effectively program securities with all kinds of incredible rights and obligations and cash flow payoffs and behavior that are triggered based on certain events that happen externally. I think we've only begun to see financial innovation in this space beyond the meat and potatoes steps that we've been doing currently, which is, let's see if we can register it on a blockchain. Let's see if we can perform the issuance. Let's see if we can digitize the cash leg. I think the true innovation will probably explode in a couple of years. And it may be that actually gets driven by existing players from the crypto world that are less, let's say, currently less constrained by regulation than you might see mainstream finance.
All right, we're going to wrap up there, John. Thank you so much for the presentation. So if everyone could give John a virtual round of applause.